Extra podcast for this kind of special one-off episode where we're looking at the Blade films. And I know earlier this month I said, we're going to shelve the DTVC Extra for now, and that was the plan, was to shelve it. But as you may also remember, I talked about going to see the first Blade film in the theater. It was playing at the Landmark Ritz here in Philadelphia, and it was a really fun experience. And recently, I'm going to be going on the Lambcast podcast to talk about the new Nosferatu film. It's kind of one of those deals where Richard Kirkham, who organizes and hosts the Lambcast podcast, I reached out to him about being on the show, and he gave me some of the episodes that were coming up in just December, and I saw Nosferatu, and I was like, oh, I love that movie, right? Think about the Murnau film, or even the Werner Herzog Klaus Kinski film. So I was excited, and I said, yeah, definitely, I'm up for the Nosferatu one. And then as I was looking it up online, I saw there was a 2024 one, and I asked him, I was like, is it the new one? He's like, yeah, it's the new one. I was like, okay. So I had to go to the theater. So I'll talk about that theater experience in a second. Not talk about the film. That's going to be on the that podcast episode, which I'll when it comes out, I'll let everybody know. But anyway, so one of the things, on that episode, he mentioned, like, hey, can you mention some other vampire films that you like? And I was thinking, oh, the other two Blade films are on Pluto. So maybe I'll watch those again to kind of get me in the mood for going to see some vampire films. So I watched those. Of course, I also watched the Murnau and the Werner Herzog Nosferatus as well, just to kind of get myself in the mood for those films. And after I'd watched the other two Blade films, so now I'd seen 1, 2, and 3, I thought, I could do a DTVC Extra podcast just talking about those. And then, of course, the other thing, too, is this time of year at my job, because a lot of my colleagues live in Europe, and for my European audience, I'm sure you are well aware that you get much more time off than we do in America. In America, the way Christmas works is you get Christmas Day off. That's it. But I had, time off saved up, so I was able to take the Christmas Eve, and I guess, we don't call it Boxing Day in America. We call it the day after Christmas, but it would be Boxing Day in the UK. I think my colleagues who live in Hungary, they get pretty much from Tuesday through Friday off. And I think that's also what my Swiss colleagues get as well, or my colleagues living in Switzerland. So what it means is that, there's not as many people in the office. And so I had a little bit more free time. Work wasn't really kind of bogging me down as much. So I thought, okay, why don't I just do these episodes here? But not one episode, just one episode with these 3 movies here. And this, I figure we'll make it happen. But yeah, before we get stuck in on that first Blade film, I do want to talk about my experience going to see Nosferatu at the AMC Dine-In here in Philadelphia. So I've been there once already this year to see Wolverine and Deadpool. I couldn't remember if I had seen a movie other than I saw Cinderella's Revenge out in the suburbs. That was for screenwriter Tom Joliffe, who wrote that film. So it was kind of a little bit of a unique experience going to that. But I couldn't remember if I had been to the AMC Dine-In for anything else before Deadpool and Wolverine when that came out. But to give you a sense, it's like these big recliners. They've got you've got a tray table at your seat that you can put your cup with a cup holder in it. You can recline the seat. You can there's buttons that allow you to kind of move it back and forth and all kinds of stuff like that. One of the other things is there's heated seats. I didn't realize that the seats were heated. So as I was, to be fair with that Nosferatu film, there was some moments where I was kind of getting a little bit, I don't want to say uncomfortable. It was also a 9:30 a.m. matinee that I went to, so I got up early for that. So I was getting a little tired, and I must have accidentally hit the heated seat button because suddenly my seat just got really hot. And then I looked and saw this red button was glowing next to my, kind of in the seat back area there. And so I had to quickly turn that off. It was, I never experienced that before. Absolute pain from the heated seats. I don't know who wants that thing on the highest level. That's got to be, you got to be an interesting person to, not interesting, but you want that kind of heat. Yeah, definitely. It was definitely painful. But anyway, beyond that, there was trailers. There was a half hour's worth of trailers before I started the movie. And it's interesting because the film industry is complaining about people not going to the theaters as much, right? Like AMC, whatever, Cinemagic, whatever these places are, Regal, they're complaining about losses. They're complaining about not pulling in as much money. But it's like, what other experience is there where you have a ticket that gives you a time to be there for, and then whatever it is that you're doing, it starts a half hour after the time. I mean, I guess a wedding, right? A wedding always, is like later, right? Like when you show up at the wedding, you've still got all this time that you got to wait before the bride walks down the aisle and the vows and all that stuff, right? That maybe that's like the closest thing to it, but it's like, when I get a train out of Amtrak or a regional rail train or something like that, it's not like it says the train's leaving at 9:30, but but I get there at 9:30, and for a half hour, I get previews of other train services that I could be using, right? Mixed with commercials. It doesn't work that way. Or when I go to see a sporting event, the game starts at 7:10. It's not like 7:10 to 7:40 is previews of other teams that might be playing at that park later on that season, right? They get the national anthem, the starting lineups, all that stuff out of the way before that 7:10 start period. So the movies are the only ones that do that. And I know, yes, they've always had trailers, right? I can remember as a kid, you go and see the trailers, but there's only like a few trailers when I was a kid. Like if a movie was going to start at 9:30, if you got there at 9:35, you were lucky if they were still doing trailers. Usually the movie had started by that point. So a half hour of trailers and commercials is just obscene in my mind. So the movie really didn't start until 10. But also, of all the trailers that they showed, I think there were two movies that I would be interested in seeing, like, through a streaming. Like, none of them interested me in, like, wanting to bother to go to the theater and see them. But there was two. There was The Nickel Boys, which I think I could see that one streaming, and then Black Bag, which looks interesting enough to watch. If it ends up on a streaming service, I'd see that. But everything else, I was like, I had no interest in even seeing it for a streaming site. I mean, there's this new Wolfman movie, which I did laugh. I burst out laughing at the jump scare that they had in the trailer because you could see it coming a mile away, and then when it happened, it burst out. Which I think it kind of affected my ability to see Nosferatu because I was laughing at things in Nosferatu that I probably shouldn't have been as well. But it was just kind of ridiculous. But I was trying to think of some of the other movies. I mean, there's this one called Novocaine, which the concept of this character, it's like an action movie about this character who can't feel pain. I remember General Hospital had a storyline about a guy who couldn't feel pain. So is that what we're doing now? We're just kind of paging through old soap opera episodes. Are we gonna is the sequel to it? Is his evil twin going to show up in town and like seduce his girlfriend or whatever? I mean, I don't know. So that wasn't doing anything for me. There was a Woody Harrelson movie about a guy who like is like deep sea diving or something and gets lost from his ship, and but it's based on a true story, so that's supposed to make me want to watch it more, which I don't know. There was a movie that had the guy from the Queen biopic or the Freddie Mercury biopic called The Amateur, which again it just looked like I don't know, look like a TNT New Classic, only without the fun of a TNT New Classic, without the like, oh, it's a Saturday and I'm getting ready to go out and I've just got this movie on in the background. It's definitely not something I'd go see in the theater. I mean, there was a lot. There's another one called Companion that was supposed to be some kind of offbeat, like sadistic love story kind of thing. And probably the only thing about that upset me was that they were butchering my one of my favorite songs ever, The Flamingos, I Only Have Eyes for You. If you haven't listened to that song in a while, you should listen to it. I mean, there's like this haunting quality to it. It's just amazing. I put it in my novel, Holtman Arms. Actually, I think it was in Holtman Arms and in A Girl and a Gun. It kind of shows up because it has that haunting quality that I just kind of have to mention it. But anyway, that movie looked. I mean, it was like a half hour of just movies I don't want to see, and I was wondering, like, is it just me? Like, am I getting jaded? Which doesn't make any sense because I feel like I was more jaded in the 90s. That was when I was like too cool for anything. I mean, I wouldn't be on a podcast admitting that I listened to the Gin Blossoms in 1995, right? I mean, I'd be like, I'd be way too cool for that crap, I listen to the Goo Goo Dolls. I don't want anything to do with that stuff. But, so I feel like I'm not as jaded. I feel like I have more fun in me. I enjoy more things now than I did then when I was that sort of that teen who was too cool for everything. But I remember in the 90s, like, I would go to the movies with my friends, and there might be 3 or 4 trailers. If there were 4 trailers, probably 3 out of those 4 movies I wanted to go see. And at least one of those 4 was like a definite, like, we're going to see that the day it opens. And there just isn't that going on right now. And I was trying to even think of next year, like, if there's anything that I really, really need to see that badly. I mean, that Superman movie, I don't know. I don't know if I really need to see it in the theater or if I can wait till it's on Max, because it's eventually going to be on Max, right? Thunderbolts, the Captain America movie. I just don't know. And I was trying to think of beyond that, like what else is opening next year that like, and of course, like, you got something like this Nosferatu film that I didn't even know was opening. So I don't know. Again, I don't know if it's just me being more jaded or what, but I realize I've just kind of killed 9 minutes ranting about this stuff before we need to get into Blade and talk about that. So why don't we'll transition there. We'll just say that, yes, I'm a curmudgeon old man who's jaded and just doesn't like good things or new things or whatever. We'll call it that. But I kind of feel like that's not the case. I kind of feel like the movie industry is just not doing it anymore. And I don't know. Hopefully we'll get the kind of inspired stuff that we got with the Deadpool and Wolverine, but with these Blade movies that I'm going to talk about here. So yeah, why don't we jump in here on that first Blade film? And so before we get in on Blade, of course, we got to go back in time because it's what we always do. We always kind of set the stage for what happens with these movies. And when you think of comic book movies, right, Marvel is conspicuously absent from the comic book movie age. Of course, when we first started getting them, they were serials. We've talked about this when we covered our Marvel films in the past, when we looked at Marvel Cinematic Universe. When we in that early phase, that early period where we had serials, right? You had like Republic serials, where you'd have like there's a Superman serial, there's a Batman, Shazam, I think, but also Captain America was included in there. There's a Captain America serial. It really has nothing to do with the actual Captain America. It's a different character altogether. It's not fighting any of the villains from Captain America, but at least it was there. And then you've got that. There's kind of a period off from comic book movies where after the serial period, we go into a TV period. You've got like the Superman TV show, you've got the Batman TV show, and then when you get into the 70s, right, you've got Wonder Woman, Shazam, and that's where Marvel kind of gets in, right? Marvel gets in on the act with the Spider-Man TV show and the Hulk TV show. And that's kind of more what people kind of expected from comic book characters, was that it would be TV, cartoons, of course, as well. I mean, Marvel animated stuff was much bigger, I think. I mean, the DC ones were interesting because a lot of them were Hanna-Barbera, so you kind of didn't know what you were going to get with those ones. What was the one that had the Wonder Twins? Was that Super Friends or just, I don't know, where it's like you've got kind of your classic DC characters, and then you got the Wonder Twins, which my newest novel, Nadia and Aiden, I think I subconsciously borrowed from that because they are kind of Wonder Twin-ish. They kind of, like the way I described them, I wasn't really even thinking. I just kind of had it in my head, these two characters and what they would be. But I think it was subconsciously being pulled from the Wonder Twins. So yeah, my newest novel, Nadia and Aiden, if you want to kind of check out some kind of a homage to the Wonder Twins, definitely pick that book up. But anyway, so that TV period was there, and then Superman comes out in the late 70s, in amongst the major blockbusters there. And there was a sense that, you could make major motion pictures based on comic book characters, and they could be critically acclaimed. They could pull in a lot of money. They could bring in a huge audience the way like a Star Wars or a Jaws could. So suddenly that kind of opened the door a bit. But what we see, of course, with Marvel is that there's sort of this whole thing of movies being in development hell. I mean, I think they were starting as far back as 75, so even before the first Superman movie, to try to adapt a Spider-Man live action film. And then as they're developing it in the early 80s, Superman 3 comes out and kind of tanks the market. And then you've got the whole Golden Globe as canon thing where they were trying to do it. And then, some of their projects don't do as well. For example, Superman 4. And then, canon gets bought out, but Golan goes and makes his own 21st film company. He does the Captain America film, and he starts looking at maybe doing Spider-Man again. And then the rights are kind of going back and forth. And so kind of throughout this 90s period, Marvel sort of kind of starting and stopping. They're trying to make something, and at the same time, it's not like DC was really killing it. They had this major success in the Batman film, and you had Batman and Batman Returns, which do really well, and that kind of kicks off this new era of comic book films, right? So you get Superman comes out in sort of the major, the sort of this new blockbuster era of comic book films, and so it wasn't really confined to just comic book characters, but you had like Indiana Jones, you had Back to the Future, you kind of had these big budget, blockbuster adventure kind of thing, Star Wars, of course, and Superman was a part of that, but I think there was a sense of like, okay, maybe there's other characters that we can do the same thing with, and it just never quite happened because it is a short window between 78 Superman and 83 Superman 3 where the bottom falls out a bit. And then we get the 89 Batman where it's kind of like, okay, let's let Tim Burton, do his thing and see what happens. And of course, it was a runaway success. It was a huge deal. And then in that period, I think in the 90s, there was this idea of like a darker comic book character, whether it was like a darker historical character. So you get like maybe like the Shadow, the Phantom, that kind of thing. The Mask had kind of a mix of old and new in there, or you have like the Crow that's just plain darker. And so as Marvel is trying to adapt Spider-Man, and they're going through their own bankruptcies, they're going through all kinds of different issues financially at that time, I think there was also a sense of like, what did Marvel have that would fit in this 1990s darker film concept? You can see also that Joel Schumacher was kind of struggling a little bit with that with Batman Forever, and then of course Batman and Robin's the notorious, right, the infamous one there is Batman and Robin. And so you get that sense as you get into the late 90s that maybe this whole, that adapting comic books is not as easy, and there's maybe not a market for it. But what's interesting, right, is that Marvel had one character, I think, that fit with that 90s darker image of comic books, and that's Blade. I was trying to think of some other ones. I mean, Ghost Rider probably would go, but Ghost Rider doesn't have the vampire element as well that really makes it. Because remember, too, that in the 90s, vampires were a big deal. You had the Bram Stoker's Dracula, you had Interview with a Vampire. So vampires in the 90s were, and that maybe that wave was cresting as well as we get into the late 90s. So that at the same time this darker comic book movie thing was that wave was cresting, you also had the vampire thing. But Blade kind of fit that niche perfectly of what it was like the closest thing that Marvel had to what would have felt like some of those Dark Horse comics that were being adapted, like the Crow. I think Crow was either Dark Horse or Image. It was kind of, I think it was kind of shared between them as it kind of bounced back and forth. But Barbed Wire, Tank Girl, those kinds of things. Blade fits that element as well. It's like probably the only Marvel one that could do that. So at least it felt like it kind of fit with what people were doing at that time for a movie. So it kind of was the one that maybe if Marvel was looking for one to do. And of course, New Line, New Line's kind of the perfect the perfect production company to make something like that, to make a Blade type movie and make it work. But then at the same time, you've got Wesley Snipes, who in the earlier part of the 90s was trying to adapt a Black Panther film, and the studios just really weren't listening because, again, there wasn't a market for that kind of comic book at the time. Even though the character's name is Black Panther, right? It's a much more, when you watch that, the actual adaptation that they did do in 2018 when they finally made it work, it's a much more bright and open kind of thing. It's not a dark, seedy underbelly kind of movie that the 90s were still looking for and still wanted. But when Wesley Snipes agrees to do Blade because he sees that he can't do Black Panther, it feels like he brings a Black Panther element to Blade. He kind of brings this overarching, like, larger-than-life superhero presence to the role. And I think what's interesting about that is that when watching Blade again, when I watched it in the movie theater here in Philadelphia, which was a really fun experience. If you ever get a chance to see that movie in the theater again, definitely jump at it. I saw it. So the movie came out in August of 1998, and I saw it when I got back to school that fall at University of Maine, because the University of Maine had this like low budget theater next to like one of the last existing Ames department stores in, I guess it would have been Orono or Old Town. It was always hard to tell. University of Maine is based in Orono, but like the town lines between Orono and Old Town, I never was able to, for the 5 years I was going to school there, I was never able to figure it out. But anyway, there was this movie theater there that it showed films that had been out of the theater for a little while. And on Tuesdays they did dollar movie nights. So and that was just like kind of a thing that we always did. We'd go to see dollar movie nights. And I think we saw Blade, the second Blade film on a dollar movie night, but I think we also did the same thing for this one, that we went, caught it in the theater for a dollar movie night in the fall when I would have gotten back to school. So it probably would have been like September, October that it would have been playing there. So that was when I first saw it. But then seeing it again, it was a really fun experience. It was a lot of people my age who had seen it when it first came out that were in the theater for that time. But then also you had a lot of younger people that were coming to see it. And, I think partly because of that character being a part of Deadpool and Wolverine, I think that people were curious about it. They wanted to kind of see what were these Blade movies all about. And this was kind of a really great opportunity to do that, on the big screen, no commercials, anything like that. So it was a really fun experience. And one of the things that I was struck by is that, I think in Deadpool and Wolverine, there was a sense that they were paying homage to the fact that Wesley Snipes' Blade kicks off this next age of comic book films, right? So we're kind of closing out in the 90s. We're closing out the Batman, darker, grittier comic book thing. And as we get into the 2000s, we're starting a new age. And I would say that new age really starts in earnest maybe with the X-Men or with the Spider-Man movie. But the Blade movie, this first Blade movie, acts as like a bridge, I felt like, where it still has that darker, grittier feel of the 90s comic book movie, but then Wesley Snipes is infusing something new into it that I think begets, the Hugh Jackman Wolverine, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, and sort of these real superhero-driven kind of things, these larger-than-life characters, right? It's not enough anymore to just be like, okay, which big name star do we want to have play Batman in this movie, right? It's like, okay, well, Michael Keaton, we can have Michael Keaton, we can have anybody. So let's do Val Kilmer, let's do George Clooney, which I love George Clooney as Batman. I just want to get that out there. I love him as Bruce Wayne probably more than I love him as Batman. You can't go wrong with George Clooney in a tux, especially in the late 90s. It's always going to work. But that idea that like, hey, we just have a revolving list of names playing Batman. No. In this case, it's like nobody else is going to be Blade, right? It's going to be Wesley Snipes. He's going to make this character his own. Hugh Jackman then makes Wolverine his own. Tobey Maguire makes Spider-Man. And again, they reboot it later with Andrew Garfield, but still it's that idea of this larger than life kind of thing that kind of makes the 2000s a different comic book universe. And of course, that's the rise of Marvel, right? Blade also starts the rise of Marvel. And I did read that with all the development hell that was going on with Spider-Man, when this Blade movie, when it comes out and it is successful, that's the thing that pushes the Spider-Man movie forward. That and the fact that the X-Men movie was in development at that time, that Fox was developing the X-Men movie. It was like, okay, if Fox is doing X-Men, if this Blade film is successful, we should be doing Spider-Man. It just makes total sense. And of course, Sony bought the rights from Marvel and started making that movie. So you can say that this Blade movie is the genesis of what becomes sort of the rise of Marvel. And I think this period of time that Blade kicks off, again, I see Blade more as a bridge between the old ones and the new, and that maybe X-Men or Spider-Man really kicks off that age, and that age goes all the way through until I'd say Iron Man, which I think Iron Man in 2008 is another bridge movie, but it sort of, again, it kind of bridges this 2000s period where there's a lot of hit and miss going on with the new version of the shared universes and the connected characters and all of that, which is something else that comes up here in this Blade film as we get into it a little bit, because there was a sense of wanting to do more of a shared universe with this film. So, but yeah, why don't I get in a little bit on the plot here, and then talk about why I love this thing so much, why this movie is one of my favorites, and it probably always will be one of my favorite comic book movies. I can't imagine 5 comic book movies ever being created they're going to be better than this for me. Just just thinking about it, especially if I put 1 and 2 together, I can't imagine there being 8 or 9 to knock both of them out of a top 10 for me when it comes to comic book movies. But anyway, let's get in here. I mean, the basic premise, right? That Wesley Snipes is playing Blade, who is his mother, while she was pregnant with him, is bitten by a vampire, Deacon Frost, and when he's born with both the good parts about being a vampire, but none of the bad parts, especially the sensitivity to light, right? He can walk during the day. That's why they call him Daywalker. Now, in the comics, this character was kind of more just a normal human who just, had some vampire elements, who had kind of a mix of both, but he wasn't like stronger, faster, anything like that. So again, Wesley Snipes is making this Blade into something different. Again, it's a cross between Black Panther and Blade more. But again, it's electric, right? When we see this one on the screen, it's absolutely electric. Now, Deacon Frost, of course, was also a character in the comics. He was an old deacon from he was born like the 1840s, and he bites Blade's mother in like 1929. That's kind of the timeline of when it happens. So they move this forward to the future where, even though Stephen Dorff's character is older, he's more of a Gen X character. This is more of a Gen X baddie that we have here. And the whole thing is kind of more in a Gen X role, right, with raves, kind of a later Gen X thing, but still a Gen X thing with the raves and the music and all of that. But also, as the story goes on, right, we find out that Deacon Frost is he's sort of taking over from all the vampires, and he's got these evil plans where he's going to bring back this old spirit that's going to make him like this super powered vampire character, and Blade is the only one who can stop him, right? But of course they need Blade's blood, because Blade has special blood as like a human/vampire, right? So his special blood is the thing that will make this spirit or something rise to the surface and all of that. And so, of course, yeah, Blade has to defeat him, and when he does, we think like everybody's happily ever after, but we know there's going to be a sequel. There's more vampires to be killed. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I was watching it again, the thing that I was really struck by is how much Wesley Snipes was bringing sort of these Hong Kong martial arts elements, Japanese samurai elements to the film. And I was reading the trivia that a lot of this was him, that he wanted more of this in the movie. I think one of the things was, I think it was a Demolition Man that he made, where they had to they had to make him slow down his martial arts because it was too fast for the film editing of that day, and it didn't look good. And of course, I think he was probably upstaging Stallone in that. So the fact that they kind of just let him go with it here is just absolutely amazing. I mean, the end fight that he has with Stephen Dorff with the samurai sword stuff was just absolutely beautiful. And we've talked about that end fight on Spotlight in a Fight with Ty from Coleman. So I can't remember what episode it was, but we did talk about that one on there. It's just absolute beautiful stuff. the vampire element. One of the things they decided to go with for this movie is less of a mystical element of vampires. So there's no like the cross or needing to be invited into a house or any of that other stuff, which I think is good just because I've never really understood that kind of thing anyway. Like for example, the vampire needing to be invited into your house, but like a lot of times the vampire's manipulating you to invite you into their house, which I think is kind of goes against the spirit of the law. And I always kind of feel like these vampire laws, it feels like the spirit would be better than the actual, the letter of the law. But maybe I'm wrong about that. So they kind of do away with all of that. There's more of this idea of it being sort of this blood virus kind of thing. And there's a woman who's a hematologist who is like kind of studying these things and trying to come up with a cure. All of that was really interesting. And I thought, I think that was a really good approach to do it in. But yeah, I mean, ultimately what this movie does is it changes what we think of these comic book movies, right? It kind of goes back to the Christopher Reeves model of we want some larger than life presence who is going to be tied to this character, who when we think of that character, that's the image we're going to have in our head. So, and I think of like kind of different ones, whether it's, Superman, I think Christopher Reeve. I remember reading the Dracula novel, and I hadn't even seen the Dracula movie, but when I was reading the novel, I was thinking of Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And so we get that here with Blade. And again, this is something that's going to maybe hurt the franchises a little bit as they go on because, for example, with the X-Men movies, right, there's that joke in Deadpool and Wolverine where Ryan Reynolds tells Hugh Jackman, you're going to be making these movies until you're 90, right? Because now nobody else can play Wolverine. And I think they might be thinking about doing that. I think they might be thinking about having somebody else play Wolverine. I don't know how it's going to work. I don't know how it's going to go. So interesting vibe, right? Because when you think of the DC universe, right, like they have trouble finding a new Superman, but they can just plug in any kind of Batman that they want and see how it goes. I mean, the fact that Ben Affleck could do it was kind of crazy. But this is, again, this is kind of going back to that element there. And again, I think too is it brings on a kind of a lighter, more fun element to a darker kind of film. So it kind of bridges, it kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be seeing soon here when we get into the X-Men movie, the Spider-Man movie. And of course, what we're going to see as we look at these other two Blade films is that they are starting to populate in a new world. So in this sense, Blade is almost creating the new world, right? It's coming from an old world, but it's also starting to set the stage for what the new world is going to be. And I think in that sense, that's why we should be paying those respects to Wesley Snipes for what he created here, what he did here in this character, and I think as we go further on in the series, and especially we get to Blade Trinity, where he's kind of kept out of the loop, the creative process, and they don't really let him do as much. And I think maybe it was because part of it was they realized what they had done, that they had tied themselves to Wesley Snipes. They couldn't branch out or do other things. And I think when we get to that third movie, you see how they're starting to try to maybe branch out to try something new with a Night Stalker series or something like that, because he had kind of come out of the gate as so strong in this character. So there's that there too. One thing before I wrap this one up here and we take a break and then we start looking at Blade, the second Blade movie, there was a thought that they were going to have Morbius from the comic books be the baddie in the second film, and they were going to tease him at the end, or they wanted to tease him at the end of this film. And Marvel said, no, we want to do our own franchise with Morbius. So again, right, we're seeing that old approach is still there of, oh no, all of our characters need to be siloed and they need to have their own franchises and do their own things. I think it's one reason what made the X-Men one interesting was that you had a whole bunch of characters and you could kind of pull them in and do different things with them. But right, Spider-Man comes in and Spider-Man is completely siloed off. Now, I don't know that it didn't say that Sony had specifically bought the rights to Morbius when they bought Spider-Man. So I don't know how that worked, if they ended up getting Morbius later, or it didn't say that. They could have used Morbius in this film, and they just didn't. Marvel decided that they thought they could use Morbius for something else. Total shame, right? I think it would have been awesome to get Morbius in that second film, and again start building out that universe with more Marvel characters, because I don't know that they really do. I don't think any of the other characters that we get, like Whistler, the Whistler character, played by Chris Christopherson, he is from, I think, a Spider-Man animated series. So similar to Harley Quinn, right? Where Harley Quinn was in Batman, the animated series, and she becomes her own character. I think it was kind of the same thing here, was that they they created the Whistler character in that cartoon when Blade appeared in the cartoon, and then they just liked him so much they used him in the movie. So really, right now it's just Blade and Deacon Frost that we have, and I guess Dracula eventually, when he's in the third movie, he was in the comics as well. I think that it was Tomb of Dracula, right, where Blade gets his first appearance. But so at the same time that we've got Marvel kind of sort of pushing this thing, going in a different direction, or kind of moving comic books in a new direction, comic book movies in a new direction. They're also still sticking with those old tried and true things of siloing characters and trying to give them all their own franchises, making them their own properties and that kind of thing. And it's kind of too bad, right? It's going to take until Iron Man comes out. I say it's going to take until Iron Man comes out in '08 to push this process forward. But actually, I mean, the old Hulk movies, right? They Thor was in one of the Hulk movies, Daredevil and Trial of the Incredible Hulk. So they knew that it could have worked. They just didn't do it, which unfortunately was too bad. But yeah, why don't we take a break here, and then when we come back, I will bring up, we'll start talking about Blade.
Available now. Told in a unique, dual first-person narration style, Nadia and Aiden explores what it means to be American from the standpoint of two kids who grew up in France with an American mother. It also looks at how we define family beyond DNA and blood relations, when life isn't always that simple. You can find Nadia and Aiden on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and Kindle Unlimited.
Back.
The link is
we're going to get in on Blade 2 here. Before we do, I did realize I had my notes a mention about Howard the Duck, and I missed it. I think I just kind of skipped right ahead talking about the Spider-Man attempts at Spider-Man adaptations. But yeah, 1986, Howard Duck, technically the first Marvel live-action big screen film. So if you're, if you're listening and I kind of went over it and you're like, hey, why aren't you mentioning Howard Duck? Mention it now. So sorry I forgot to mention the previous one, but I don't even know how germane Howard the Duck is to the conversation here, but it is definitely important in the sense that it was Marvel's first live action big screen feature film. And Blade kind of 12 years later, Blade really is the one that really kicks off the Marvel thing. But yeah, I guess I should mention Howard the Duck there for that. So that was kind of an important thing. But I think the other thing I kind of forgot to mention was that the original Blade movie was longer, and that the end fight scene was actually supposed to be Blade fighting like a red glob of goo that was supposed to be what Stephen Dorff turns into when the ritual goes through. And I guess test audiences, for obvious reasons, wanted nothing to do with that, so they reshot that end fight scene. That end fight scene is so beautiful and really makes the movie, it's like the kind of the perfect cherry on top for what a great film that was. Originally wasn't what we were going to have. We were going to have something else, and so it is interesting. It is maybe an interesting thing to note that between the fact that the length was changed and that the audiences were looking for something a little bit different, that Blade almost, I wonder if it kind of comes at the right time, that audiences were starting to get out of this darker movie kind of thing. I mean, we're kind of getting out of the darker thing, period. Right, as we get into the 2000s here, as we get into Blade, the second Blade movie, the world is changing a little bit, right? We aren't all into grunge, we aren't all into darker things. We're kind of like, we like boy bands now. For the darker, edgier thing, it's more of like a pop punk thing, or it's white rappers doing white rap over like heavy guitar metal kind of stuff. It's not the kind of darker, edgier, I don't care about big things kind of thing anymore. And so as Blade is sort of transitioning, or kind of as the thing that's sort of transitioning us into the 2000s, the 2000s overall is sort of changing from what the 90s were. And I don't know, I think there is a sense that we sort of 90s nostalgia and kind of wanting that 90s period back. And I'm kind of one of those people, because I think that sunshine, more sunshiny, rosier 2000s thing that we get, and of course part of it is we get it out of, after 9/11, there's almost a sense of like, let's just have fun and not worry about things as much. I think there is a part of like the 90s that the 90s felt more substantial than the 2000s did. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. And what we get post 9/11, what we get in the 2000s that is less substantial, these boy bands, these rap, white rap rocker kind of things, the Kid Rocks and the Limp Bizkits, none of it it feels like it's very firm. It's an interesting thing, because
recently there was that Yacht Rock documentary that HBO made that was produced by Bill Simmons, who does a podcast that I really enjoy, has really great sports commentary. And the Yacht Rock thing, they were trying to describe it as like this musical movement, which I know my wife and I, of course, we were both born in the late 70s, and we grew up listening to that 70s, 80s soft rock music and thinking it was crap, and then kind of coming back to it because we were appreciating the musicianship that was a big part of it. Not just Michael McDonald, but or the guys from Toto, but even like this, or the Steely Dan guys who really get shine in the documentary, but even like David Pack from Ambrosia, and sort of just layering the instruments and the vocals and that kind of thing. There was a different appreciation for it, but there has been a little bit of a backlash to this yacht rock thing, because again, the Yacht Rock documentary is trying to talk about this great musicianship, and it wasn't just these sappy lyrics and this like easy breezy music kind of thing, but and it shouldn't be dismissed as yacht rock, I guess. This kind of this kitschy thing that millennials and younger music fans are into now suddenly, where they're going to concerts with like Captain from the Captain and Tennille hats on, and they're kind of treating it as this kitschy thing when there was some real musicianship there. There's been a backlash to that from people, I think, who were born in the late 50s, early 60s, who look at that whole thing as this schmaltzy, horrible period of music, and it hurts their sensibilities to think about that. I mean, think of like Anthony Bourdain in the documentary. Questlove talks about how he'd made a yacht rock playlist for Bourdain, and then Bourdain took his own life, and he decided to post the playlist on Spotify because, of course, wasn't able to give the playlist, the song, the mix CD to Bourdain. But from Bourdain's standpoint, right, being born in the late 50s and growing up, kind of being a part of that music scene that was coming in the late 70s, where CBGBs, the Ramones, all that kind of thing, right? He would look at that and just be like, the whole thing of like the yacht rock music, or like late 70s, early 80s adult contempo soft rock music, would just have killed his sensibilities completely. And I guess for me, thinking about it, trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody born in the late 50s, early 60s, it would be like if in 20 years from now, somebody made this documentary talking about how great the boy band music was, or how great these white rap rockers were, and how amazing that was at that time. If somebody did that, I would probably lose my mind. I would be like on any kind of social media or any kind of music publication that I could, just talking about how these people are so out of their minds and I can't believe they're doing this. So I totally get that. But anyway, going back to sort of the world of Blade 2. Blade 2 comes out in 2002. I remember, again, like my friends, like the previous film, I saw it at the indie theater, or like the local cheap theater. One of the big things I remember about that one was that in the end fight scene between Luke Goss's character and Wesley Snipes, Luke Goss like swings Wesley Snipes around and throws him. And at the time, we'd been playing Tekken Tag Tournament, and I used the Kings. And the Kings had a move called the Giant Swing that would, like, essentially, once you grabbed the character and got him in the Giant Swing, it would take off more than half of their life. And so it was this big joke, because you would see the King. I used the Kings a lot, and we found out later that they were overpowered, that they were, as the kids would say, OP, that you shouldn't have been using them. And I would use them. And just we would do like winner stays kind of deal, and I would sometimes run up like 100 consecutive wins. I'd just be sitting there playing. It would be like this big thing of like, can somebody beat Matt when he's using the Kings? And then later, I probably had an unfair advantage using them. They actually kind of reduced some of their arsenal of moves so that they would be harder to use. But that Giant Swing move, when we saw Luke Goss give Wesley Snipes the Giant Swing, it was kind of like this whole fist pump thing where we were all just into it, like, yes, oh, how awesome is that? So I remember that moment, seeing that film there. But yeah, I mean, I think, Blade 2 comes out in this interim period where we get X-Men, right? X-Men comes out in the year 2000, but Spider-Man hadn't come out yet. All right, so Blade comes out in March of 2002. And then Spider-Man comes out, I think, in April of 2002. It sort of just takes the world by storm. I mean, that movie, adjusted for inflation, I think it is one of the highest-grossing Marvel movies ever. It's one of the highest-grossing movies, period, ever. I mean, it grossed like over $800 million in 2002. There just aren't a lot of movies that have pulled in that kind of money. It really sort of changes the game, because then you get this influx of Marvel movies at that time. And I think Blade kind of gets swept under the undercurrent of that when we talk about the third film. But right now, there hasn't been that yet. That hasn't happened yet. We're kind of just getting the fits and starts where we get the X-Men movie, we get Hugh Jackman in that. But even that X-Men movie, it's got iconic roles, right? It's got Patrick Stewart as Professor X, it's got Ian McKellen as Magneto, and it's got Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So at least it's giving us the start of what is going to just be, something fantastic. So it is a big deal that movie comes out in between these two Blade movies, but it wasn't enough at that time to be like, okay, Blade needs to substantially change what they're what those films are doing and do something completely different. And so in that sense, we get some really great stuff here. First off, the director of the first film, Stephen Norrington, he doesn't do the second film. So in looking for a new director, they get Guillermo del Toro. Just absolutely, one of my favorite directors. Love Pan's Labyrinth. That's one of my favorite movies. Of course, he goes on and does the Hellboy movies. That's why he doesn't do Blade Trinity, is that he gets the opportunity to do Hellboy. And that was a project he'd always wanted to work on. So, and I'm wondering, he meets Ron Perlman in this movie and casts him in Hellboy. I think that might have been part of the deal, is he probably liked how good of a job Perlman does in Blade, in the second Blade movie. But I know Guillermo del Toro, he wasn't a big fan of the dialogue in this film, but it was one of those things too where he was like, I'll kind of go with it. I think later, Guillermo del Toro, del Toro writes every movie that he's done out. I think it's Blade, the second Blade movie, I think is one of the few movies that he didn't write. For the most part, he writes his movies after that. But it gives this movie the kind of feel that you would want from a sequel to a Blade movie. Because at the same time, del Toro does come from a comic book background. He likes comic book films, but also I think he saw what Wesley Snipes did with the first movie, and really wanted Snipes' input on what he wanted to do with Blade in this film, and I think that's that marriage there works really well. That he saw what Snipes was doing, and he deferred to him at a lot of times where Snipes would be like, I don't know if Blade would do that here. I don't know if that's where Blade would go. And Del Toro, because he was so key in doing that, I think I may have called him Del Tormo in a few moments here, so it's Del Toro. Yeah, so just in case if you hear some Del Tormos in there and you're like, man, Matt doesn't know it. Yeah, sometimes I just kind of get that name wrong, but Del Toro, Guillermo del Toro. I think there's a lot of M's and R's and O's in there, and sometimes I get that wrong. But anyway, the fact that he deferred was really great. But then also, he comes at the movie with this horror background, and not just a horror background, but also kind of a 70s, 80s grindhouse kind of thing too. So he takes the head baddie in the film and bases him off Nosferatu, which I thought was really a really cool decision. And then Luke Goss's baddie character and the baddies that are kind of there, what do they call them, like the Reavers or something like that, they're based off of the Morlocks from the 1970s Planet of the Apes movie. Was it Beyond the Planet of the Apes? So to kind of pull those kinds of, I don't know, those different inspirations, to pull things from these different places like that, I thought was a really, really cool idea. And again, makes the movie just look really, really nice. Makes the movie look like different in a way that I don't think we had expected. Now, going back to that Morbius thing, they had, I guess, Stephen Norrington. Part of the reason why they didn't do Morbius for this film, according to Wikipedia, was that Stephen Norrington, when he bowed out, they didn't use the character there. That was one reason why they went in a different direction, because when they got Guillermo del Toro on, they wanted to kind of go in the direction that he was thinking as well. I mean, that does make sense there. But I think, again, Marvel, I guess in 2000, Marvel went to Artisan and said, yeah, we could make they wanted kind of like a basket or package of characters, and Morbius was one of them. And so they had promised to make a Morbius film, which they never end up making. That never ends up happening. Like, eventually, it's not until we get this Jared Leto Morbius film that just ends up being a complete dud. But you can catch it. I think I've been meaning to see it. It's on Disney Plus, so I probably should make it happen. Watch it, maybe talk about it on a future episode here of this. But yeah, so there was still a sense maybe going into 2002 that they could use Morbius. And then, in 2000, when the character sold off, they realized they had to go in a different direction. And that's when Del Toro comes up, and Goyer, the screenwriter, had kind of come up with this other idea here that they go with. So, yeah, maybe I'll do a quick synopsis here, because we are turning into the idea of the story here. Essentially, this takes place, whatever it is, 4 years after the previous Blade film. It's definitely a few years after.
And it turns out that Chris Christopherson's character doesn't die in the first film, but that rather he is alive as a vampire, and Snipes is looking for him. Is hoping that he can turn him back, but we'll see what happens. At the same time, Luke Goss is this other version of a vampire with like a jaw that like unhinges. It opens up, kind of almost like the Predator. It kind of looks a little bit like that. And not only are they preying on humans, but they're preying on vampires, and so the vampires need a weapon to be able to take this guy down. And so this head vampire guy, his daughter gets together this group called, I don't know what they call, like the Blood Walkers or something like that, the Blood Squad. I don't know what they were, but anyway, so it's a group of vampires that were going to essentially take out Blade. That was their plan, and now the plan is, well, why don't we team up with Blade and take out these vampires instead? That's what the goal is going to be from there. And of course, there's a sense of, can you trust these vampires, right? Maybe not. Ron Perlman, of course, he's of Jewish descent, or he's Jewish. He plays a Nazi vampire, which I think makes it all the more interesting because of him playing this sort of neo-Nazi character despite being Jewish. I think in a way that actually helps the movie, because when Blade finally takes him out, we want him to, but I think Ron Perlman wants to be taken out, right? Like, he wants his character to be destroyed. We get Donnie Yen as one of them as well. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a really good fight scene with Blade, but he works as a fight choreographer on the film. And Snipes said there were some other people, including himself, that were doing fight choreography, so it was almost a sense of like a competition to see who could do it the best. So Yen's character, while we don't see his character as much, I mean, he gets a few good scenes in the film. He's working behind the scenes to take this fight choreography from the previous film to another level, which again just makes it so beautiful. So again, eventually these vampires turn on Blade, and he's got to find his way to defeat them. Should he team up with Goss? Not team up with Goss? They still maybe has to defeat Goss, right? It's all kind of a whole thing there. But eventually, it's Blade. He's going to take everybody out. I mean, as much as we love that giant swing scene, there's another scene, right, where, again, just like in the previous film, they need to use Blade's blood to create this new, to kind of, I guess, the whole reason why these vampires are created, these Reavers or these other vampires that attack vampires are created, is that this head guy who's based off of Nosferatu, he is trying to genetically modify vampires so that they don't have the weaknesses that vampires have, so they can sort of ascend to this greater, have this greater ascendancy. And the biggest thing he wants is to make it so that they're not sensitive to light, right? That's kind of the biggest thing. But also that, like, their hearts can't be staked. They're not vulnerable to silver, all of those kinds of things that make it so Blade can take out vampires. He's sort of trying to genetically create this vampire that can't do that, and that's how Luke Goss is created. That's where he's sort of like a test tube baby son of this Nosferatu vampire. And So that part of it, I thought that was kind of a really cool idea, and I really liked the way that was executed. It worked really well. But they decide that they need Blade's blood, and so he sort of gets weakened, right, because all of his blood is drained. And Chris Christopherson kind of dumps him into this big vat of blood that the Nosferatu character, he kind of bathes in this blood. And when he comes up, you get that whole, like, that, was it Fatboy Slim, name of the game, where it's like, listen, all you motherfuckers, right? And he kind of comes out and he starts taking people out. He's catching his sunglasses in midair when Chris Christopherson throws them to him. It's just such a beautiful scene. It's like one of the best scenes ever. I mean, again, this is Wesley Snipes taking a character from the previous film where he's just an absolute bad man as Blade. And with Guillermo del Toro bringing in what he has, the horror elements and the comic book fan elements that he brings, but also saying, I trust what Wesley Snipes is doing with this character, and I want him to bring this character forward and develop him even further. And that's what, and Wesley Snipes is all about it, and he says, like, I relish the challenge of playing Blade again. When they came to him about making the sequel, that line, I relish the challenge of playing him again, because he knew that he had to take this character forward, and he does it. It's an absolutely beautiful thing, and it's everything you'd want in this sequel. Again, if you can't have Morbius, if you can't have him fighting Morbius, which would have been a really cool idea, would have really worked. And again, it was just one of those missteps that Marvel makes in this period. They make some other missteps we're going to see when we get into the next film. That there's other missteps that happen here. But again, Blade 2 is in this interim period where before Spider-Man comes out, because I think the explosion happens after Spider-Man. I mean, again, the success of Blade, the success of the X-Men movie, it gets all of these things in development, right? Everybody wants a piece of Marvel at this point. So when Artisan comes, they're like, give us, whatever characters you want to give us. I think, Punisher is the one that they end up making, but they wanted to look at some other ones. Fox is coming along. Okay, you're letting us do X-Men. What about Fantastic Four? What other characters can we do? I was trying to think of like what I guess, yeah, Fox also did Daredevil, right? They do that Daredevil, which is going to be coming soon. Universal, they had the rights to the Hulk. I think they also had the rights to the Hulk through their theme parks and all of that. So everybody wants a piece of Marvel at this point, but it's only kind of just starting, right? Nobody really sees the gold in it that they're going to see when Spider-Man comes out, and that kind of pushes everything in a whole different direction. And I think it's going to affect Blade when Blade Trinity comes out. I think that's going to be the problem here. But again, here in 2002, the market wasn't as saturated, it wasn't as big, there wasn't the gold there. Kind of going back to that yacht rock thing, right? It's not like the 70s where the music industry was so massive in LA that it was just like anybody could make, everybody wanted to make music, and that's where, the yacht rock guys like the Porcaro brothers and Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins, where it's just like everybody wanted to make gold, right? What was the song? People are turning music into gold. That was like kind of a yacht rock song. I can't remember it was like John Stewart. Is it John Stewart? Was that his name? Something like that. But anyway, that kind of that world. It kind of starts here for comic book movies in the 2000s with Marvel properties. It's what's conspicuously absent here is that the DC ones are going to be kind of left on the I don't know, they're going to be left out of this process. There's the Catwoman movie that's just a dud. It doesn't do anything. It's not great. Eventually, right, you get Batman Begins in 2005. Because it's kind of one of those things that DC, when they see what's happening here with the Marvel movies, they want in and they know who their two big characters are. They know it's Superman and Batman, and they try both of them and decide that Batman's the one that's going to work. All of that is going to come, but right now in 2002, it's just Blade and X-Men, right? That's all we really have, and then the Spider-Man movie's coming. It's coming next month. And I think in that world, this Blade movie works even better. It's just, there's not this sort of this expectation of what a comic book movie has to be, what it should be. It's allowed to be what we want it to be. It looks like now, I think, obviously with Deadpool and Wolverine, that was a little bit different. I think, Sam Raimi talked about with making Multiverse of Madness that I think he wished he had a little bit more freedom. He gets a little bit more freedom, I think, with the Spider-Man movies. But, again, part of the reason why we don't get a fourth Spider-Man movie is because they were rushing it. They wanted that movie out sooner, and he didn't want to make it that soon. So that's when they decided to reboot everything and do something different. At this time, there was a little bit more freedom, a little bit more openness to other things. It's sort of this period, right, with the bridge. We're talking about bridging from one to the next. And Blade as that bridge, it allowed for some freedom and flexibility that we don't get. We get fits and starts of that freedom and flexibility, I should say, right? I think 2011's Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance, that one is kind of that movie, right? I think Captain America: First Avenger is another one that I think if you were to come to in the 2000s, if you were to say I'm going to do Captain America and it's going to almost be entirely set in the 1940s during the World War II period, someone say I don't think you can do that. I don't think that's how I want my Captain America to be, right? And right, the 90s Captain America we get is a mix of the two. But it's more of a modern film that kind of harkens back somewhat to those pieces of the past. I don't think in the 2000s if you were going to make a Captain America, which we don't get Captain America, right? We don't get him until we get that 2011 one. But if you were going to do Captain America now and you said this is kind of after Blade 2, after Spider-Man comes out, we want to make a Captain America movie, I don't think you could make it the way that they end up making it in 2011. So there is a bit of a period kind of post this window here when Kevin Feige and Marvel Studios start making their own movies where they can be a little bit more like Blade 2. But yeah, Blade 2, it's a movie that it's so beautiful and I love it. It's one of my favorite
comic book movies. It's one of my favorite vampire movies ever. I was trying to decide if I like it better than the first one. I always said I did. In my head, I always had this one above the first one. But seeing the first one again in the theater recently, and then seeing this one after it, I kind of like them both the same. I almost kind of have them as a tie, which is, it's not fun for podcast conversation to say one the two movies are both as good. But yeah, I it's a shame that we don't get a lot of movies like this anymore. That they're just, people are trying to do different things. I mean, Madam Web, they were trying different things. But yeah, this is just, I don't know. I don't know how many other great things I can say about this. I just love it so much. I love, of course, and again, the supporting characters, people like Donnie Yen are a lot of fun in it as well. Bringing back Chris Christopherson, he's great. Again, Guillermo del Toro pulling from, not just from Nosferatu and Murnau, but then also from Planet of the Apes for his visuals. And again, it's what we're going to expect from him when we get Hellboy, when we get Pan's Labyrinth. These are the kind of visuals that Del Toro, again, I'm calling him Del Toro again, Del Toro, that he's known for. He's starting us off here in a comic book film doing it. And, one of the things that's interesting is that between this one and Blade Trinity, we're going to have Ang Lee's Hulk. And, I mean, Ang Lee as a director, I think overall, you'd take the Pepsi Challenge with his CV versus Del Toro's. But when it comes to the comic book movie, and again, he was trying to do different things as well, it didn't work, right? His trying to do different things didn't work. And I almost think that there's almost like a resetting of things as the 2000s go on, that, we can't let these directors just do whatever they want with these things. We need to sort of make them something a little bit more consistent, which I think is too bad. I think it's more fun to have a Blade 2. I don't know how many comic book movies we'll ever get that for me are going to be better than Blade 2. I was trying to think how many off the top of my head I would put above Blade 2. And again, I'm now tying Blade with it, but I'm Captain America Winter Soldier. I talk about that one a lot. I think that one is definitely up there. And of course, the original Superman, I would put that there. Batman Returns, I like that one better than Batman. I would put that there as well. And thinking of some of the newer Marvel ones, how many of those? I mean, Deadpool and Wolverine, I really love that one. I think I'd put that one near there. And maybe even one of those other Deadpool movies. So I think both of those Deadpool movies, as great as they are, I wouldn't put them above Blade 2 for me. I don't think I would do that. So, we're looking at like now what 22 years after that this movie comes out, and it still holds up for me as just one of the best. And when I watched it the other day, I watched it on Pluto. I'm getting commercials on Pluto, and I'm still just loving every moment of this film. So yeah, it's a shame. When we get into Blade Trinity and we see this kind of thing go south, but I think I'm going to maybe talk about, when we get into Blade Trinity, some ways that maybe we can move this thing forward, because I know these two movies are just absolute classics for me, and it's a shame that the third one we go out on one that just isn't as good. But it is nice too that we kind of give Wesley Snipes with Blade a little redemption when we get into the Deadpool Wolverine. So yeah, maybe this is a good place for us to wrap this here. We'll kind of stop this conversation here, take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up with
the war on drugs is raging, and Detective John Bainbridge is the LAPD's secret weapon against crime. Former Special Forces in Nam, he's a cop on the edge. When he and his partner Geary uncover a potential human trafficking ring, it doesn't take long before John Bainbridge realizes this thing goes all the way to the top, which doesn't scare him. That just means they'll fall that much harder when he takes them down. Part send-up and part love letter to early 90s action films, Bainbridge will take you back to the golden days of Canon, PM Entertainment, and AIP. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited from Amazon.
Right,
follow the link in the podcast
finish up this
description.
Conversation by talking about Blade Trinity, which is kind of the more infamous, right, of the three films. It's definitely a drop in quality compared to those first two. Watching it again, especially now, because you think about when I watched it in 2004, which I didn't see it in the theater in 2004. I actually saw it. I think I rented it. I can't remember. I probably rented it. So I definitely didn't see it in the theater. But you think about in 2004, right? There's not this whole like binging kind of thing that we get now, where everything's available on streaming, and so like you wouldn't watch them all within quick succession. So 3, even though it's definitely a drop from 2, maybe you don't always see it in that context, right? As being a drop from 2, but even then, even having had a couple of years from the second film, I knew what I was watching was not the same level as those previous ones, which is definitely a disappointment. I do think it is also important to look at what had changed in the world of comic book films in between
when these two movies come out, because we just talked about in the previous one, right, that in '02 when Blade comes out, or sorry, when Blade 2 comes out, it is right before Spider-Man. So it's really in this world where it's really just kind of by itself with X-Men. It doesn't have, there's really anything else happening. DC's not really doing anything at that time. They've sort of taken a break after the debacle that was Batman Forever, or Batman and Robin. So there wasn't a lot else in the comic book world at that time. But after Spider-Man comes out in '02, we get this explosion of comic book films. I mean, essentially '03, right, we get Daredevil, we get the X-Men sequel, X2, we get the Hulk movie, Ang Lee's Hulk. We get The Punisher in '04, which is, doesn't do that well either. We get Spider-Man 2, which is another huge blockbuster, wins an Oscar. And Blade Trinity is sort of the sixth of these 6 movies to come out in a 2-year period. I mean, that 2-year period is more than all of Marvel's output to that point combined, right? It's almost as much as DC's entire output, if you think about it, right? If we don't count Catwoman in '04, I guess also if you don't count, counting Steel, right, in the Swamp Thing movie. So maybe it's not quite, 8 movies isn't quite, because it's like, what was it? It would have been 10 movies, I guess, that DC, right? Because they would have had the 4 Superman, 4 Batman, and 2 Swamp Things, and then a Catwoman. So I guess it's maybe, DC still was a little bit more prolific over a 20-year span or whatever. But definitely, when we're talking about the Marvel movies, I mean, again, in a 2-year period, they put out more movies than they had previously. And these are all coming from different studios, right? So you've got Spider-Man, Columbia Pictures, which ends up becoming Sony. They're doing the Spider-Man films. 20th Century Fox is not just doing the X-Men movies, but they're doing the Daredevil movies. They're in development for Fantastic Four. Columbia is also developing Ghost Rider. Artisan does the Punisher film, which we were talking about with Artisan getting the rights to Morbius, but never making a movie with that. I think part of the reason why they don't is because the Punisher ends up being kind of a drop for them, and we don't really see Artisan come up again. I don't think Artisan doesn't really come up again here. But, and then, of course, Universal is the one who's doing the Hulk movies. We talked about they had the rights to that one. So that's part of the issue, is that, as opposed to DC, where DC makes their movies through Warner Brothers, Marvel is selling off all of their pieces and letting people make the movies. And so that kind of saturates the market. And so when Blade Trinity comes into this new market, just a short 2 years after the second Blade movie comes out, it's a completely different world. And I do think that David Goyer, who was sort of the producer and writer on the film, wanted to do some things to sort of move Blade into that direction. Essentially, instead of being the bridge across from the 90s to the 2000s comic book movie, they wanted Blade to be in the 2000s fully. And I think the way that they went about it with this idea of, like, let's bring in Jessica Biel, let's bring in Ryan Reynolds, let's kind of make it a little bit of a younger thing, and maybe spin these characters off into this, like, Night Stalkers thing in future films. Because I think there was a sense, too, that, like, they couldn't keep making these movies with Snipes, which I think also makes sense when you think about it. Like, 3 or 4 movies is usually the cap. At that time, they weren't making these long, huge franchises, right? You didn't have situations like you do with, like, Hugh Jackman, where he's playing, Wolverine in however many movies that he plays Wolverine in, or, Samuel L. Jackson playing Nick Fury in however many movies he's playing Nick Fury in, right? That wasn't the idea. There was a sense that, like, okay, after a few movies, right, we can't keep doing this anymore, so let's add some new characters to this one, spin them off into a new thing, and kind of keep this thing moving in some way, but move it into this modern period. And so, Snipes was not a fan of that. He didn't see this as the Blade character that he developed over the first 2 movies would not be hanging out with Jessica Biel and Ryan Reynolds. And certainly, like, kind of the jokey style that Ryan Reynolds brings. From Snipes' standpoint, it didn't work with the tone that they wanted the movie to be in. And you can see it. I mean, the dialogue is as bad as Del Toro said the dialogue was in Blade 2. It's worse in Blade Trinity. And there's that scene where Abigail, Jessica Biel's character, Abigail Whistler, she's sort of introducing herself to Snipes, and, he's like, she's explaining, the whole deal. She's like, yeah, after, when I got old enough, I met Whistler, and, I found out what he did, and I said I wanted in, and it's like, you wanted in? Like, what is that, it's just a kind of the trite BS stuff. And granted, Snipes has some really fantastic lines in it, and I thought that was, he still kind of manages to prop the thing up, but
the thing was apparently a hell. It was hell to shoot. Snipes was so upset that they weren't taking any of his input, despite him being a producer on the film, that he got to a point where he was only communicating with people by sending them Post-it notes. He hated the producer, director, David Goyer. Goyer was only directing because whoever they had to direct it to begin with, Snipes didn't want to work with him anymore. So the whole thing was falling apart. It wasn't going in a good direction. But then, like the movie itself, right? They bring in Dominic Purcell to play Dracula, which is just a fascinating choice. I mean, I like Dominic Purcell on the Arrow and Flash series. I like him in direct-to-video movies that we've watched. He and Uwe Boll have a great relationship. So I appreciate Dominic Purcell, but I mean, you know, the open, like, you know, lead singer of Creed, you know, Scott Stapp, like white button-up shirt with the collar open and the leather pants, walking around going to raves and stuff like that. I did discover in watching this new version, or watching the version I watched on Pluto. It's not a new version; it's the original version. But the version I watched with my friend, it was my friend Brett actually, and I remember this clearly because I watched the unrated version. There's that scene where Dominic Purcell is talking to, I thought it was Blade, but actually he's talking to Parker Posey, and he's like, "I saw Christ crucified," and my friend Brett burst out laughing, just laughed out loud at that line, and I was waiting for it this time, didn't realize that the unrated version has it, but the original version doesn't have it. So it's interesting with Pluto. I think Pluto has TV versions, but they're not edited, right? Like, so they're not cut for time. And they're not cut for language or violence, but they are TV versions because there's these edits where it looks like it should be a commercial, where it'll kind of fade out and fade back in, that looks like a TV edit. They're interesting versions on Pluto, but yeah, they don't have that great Dominic Purcell line. But you know, the idea that they're fighting Dracula and it's just kind of this thing, even with the great cast that they have involved, because you know Reynolds, I like Ryan Reynolds. I don't know if that character fit with the but he was kind of fun enough. Jessica Biel it was a great character. Natasha Lyonne is in it. Patton Oswalt is a friend of the director David Goyer. So when you hear his take on what happened on set, he definitely takes Goyer's side. Like, he looks at it as Wesley Snipes just made it a miserable experience. But I think, you know, we find out that the way that they were kind of taking his character away from him, I think he felt like Blade was his, and he was upset that they weren't taking his input on it. The same, complete opposite of what Del Toro was doing in the previous film, right? Del Toro is like, no, Wesley Snipes knows his character better than anybody else, so I'm going to defer to what he thinks Blade should be doing here. They went in an opposite direction here because, again, they were trying to kind of set the stage for something new, and again, they were trying to, instead of be the bridge between the 80s or between the 90s and the 2000s, they wanted to be on the other side with all the other movies. I think the other thing too is they probably couldn't have known that a lot of these other movies weren't going to do well. They couldn't have known that Daredevil would do poorly, that Hulk, that Punisher, Elektra comes after it. That these movies weren't going to be these major successes. If they had maybe just made a third movie that was closer in tone and theme to the previous two, we might have had a really big success there, but I don't know. Why don't I do a quick synopsis here before we kind of dig in a little bit more. So basic premise of this is it takes place, again, a couple of years after the previous movie. Parker Posey is leading this group with, Triple H is part of the group. It's interesting. She's leading the group with her brother, and there's something very Josie and the Pussycats. Remember, like, Josie and the Pussycats, like, they had the manager, and then her sister, or his sister, would hang out with them, and she was always, like, causing issues with Josie because she wanted to hook up with the other guy. And so she would always, like, try to do these things, and then they would screw up. Parker Posey and her brother, her character's, the character's brother in the movie, they really had that dynamic, which, again, it's not really helping. It's not doing you any favors when you're doing that. But anyway, they dig up Dracula. He's buried somewhere in Sumatra or wherever, it's I don't know, in Mesopotamia. And they dig him up, and he wakes up, and he starts eating people and, sucking all this blood. And suddenly, first he looks like this big demon, but then suddenly he looks like Dominic Purcell, and he's out walking around doing Dominic Purcell stuff. And they discover that there's some deal where they want to use Dominic Purcell. They want Dracula to kill Blade. That's the thing. They can't defeat Blade. At the same time, they frame Blade for killing people. So essentially, they have Blade thinking that he's attacking vampires, but instead he's killing what they call familiars. And so he gets framed for that. And so that's when we get the Night Stalkers. We get Jessica Biel. We get Ryan Reynolds. They come in and save the day. They bring Snipes over. And it does kind of make sense. Like, why would Snipes be fighting with these kids? It does seem a little bit odd that they do that. It's kind of, it's very Hanna-Barbera-ish, to be honest. Like, and I mean, imagine if you're Wesley Snipes and you're born in like the late 50s, early 60s, and you're growing up with these Hanna-Barbera cartoons, with like the Wonder Twins and Josie and the Pussycats, stuff like that. You're probably watching this movie being made here, and you're like, what are we doing? Are we going to have a talking dog next? Is that the next thing? Are we going to have a cat that like, causes problems in the background? Like, where's the next place that we go from here? Because this is all ridiculous. And that's kind of what's happening. But anyway, so while they're planning to have Dracula kill Snipes, Natasha Lyonne is this blind scientist who's working on some kind of way to wipe out all the vampires, and she just needs Blade's blood to be able to do it. And so that's kind of where the denouement is. We get to this whole big confrontation where Blade's got to fight Dracula. There's this thing. I guess if you have Dracula's blood mixed with Blade's blood, you can kill all the vampires. I guess that was the idea. But that's kind of what happens there. And then the movie ends, and that's it. And then Blade walks off into the sunset. So yeah, very unfulfilling end. And the other thing too that's interesting about this is that we're already also starting to get to this thing where we can't use numbers for sequels, right? So it's Blade 1, or just Blade, right? Blade 2, and then now it's Blade Trinity, right? It can't just be Blade 3. So it's already kind of getting to that hokey period there. And I don't know. I guess it's one of the hard things to pull off. It's hard to make a third movie in these series. I'm trying to think of how many successful third movies in the series that we had. I mean, you don't always get them as bad as this, right? Like, I don't think Iron Man 3 is as bad as this. I know a lot of people like Thor Ragnarok, but that's a little bit different because you don't get these two amazing iconic films for the first two. So it's like if Thor 1 and Thor 2 were just absolutely amazing, then you get Ragnarok. Then you say, okay, they did a good job of carrying it over. We talked about this with the Star Trek movies, right? How you had Wrath of Khan being so good that they just used the third one as kind of just a get-me-over film so that they could make the fourth one. And I mean, that could have been an interesting way to approach this movie too. It's like, let's just play it safe and just get me over, and just do a Blade fighting somebody or what, I don't know. Maybe not try so hard to make this thing fit with the rest of the comic book movies that were coming out at that time. Because, again, we don't get a lot of classics in this period. We don't get like these, amazing movies in this early, this sort of this 2000s period. I mean, this is kind of what Iron Man is born out of in 2008. And if you look at the way the movies are being made, right, in this kind of this mid-2000s, mid to late 2000s period, I mean, Spider-Man 2 is a decent one, and then Spider-Man 3 in 2007 still does really well, and it's good enough. But, man, when you get into, the X-Men Last Stand movie wasn't the best, but, Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, Ghost Rider, that movie, obviously Elektra. When Iron Man comes out, the Incredible Hulk is still part of that cinematic universe, but it's a little bit off. I really like Punisher Warzone. We talked about that on a podcast episode with Freddie Young from Full Moon Reviews, so definitely check that one out. It's a fun one. But then you get X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's just like, okay, and it's really, when we get into the second Iron Man film, and when Marvel really starts to assert itself, I think from DC's standpoint, but I think from some of the other studios like 20th Century Fox, that were, Columbia, that were making Marvel movies at that time, or making comic book movies at that time, I don't think there was a sense that Marvel Studios is sort of this upstart thing that Kevin Feige was trying to put together, that they really had their shit together any more than anybody else did, right? There was no sense that it was going to be this deluge. And I think, in DC as well, DC was sort of taking their time figuring out what to do after Batman Forever. There's a Catwoman flop, but then they put out, Superman Returns, and they put out the Batman Begins movie. They kind of test the waters, see which one takes. Okay, Batman Begins seems to be the one that's a little bit better, so we'll keep making those. And I mean, they do, right? Obviously with The Dark Knight, that's a huge success. It's probably the most successful comic book movie at that time. Though I don't know if, even adjusted for inflation, I don't think the Spider-Man movies were quite as successful as that. But then by the time they get their third movie out, Marvel Cinematic Universe has just passed everybody. It's just taken everybody over. It's an interesting thing to think about that in 2004, that Blade Trinity is sort of in this Marvel is still trying to find its way thing, and there's still this idea of this gold to be mined amongst Marvel. And it is interesting that it took Kevin Feige creating Marvel Studios to really find where the gold was and really, really be able to mine it on this level that now we're seeing it's just this sort of this ridiculous thing. but I do wonder, if it wasn't about mining for gold with Blade Trinity, but rather let's just make a third Blade movie that just closes the loop on this thing and makes it a nice, I don't know, and instead of like trying to introduce new characters that are going to be in spin-off movies or anything like that, let's just end this story here and give it the right capper that it needs. And I think that's something that's addressed in the Deadpool and Wolverine movie when we see Blade, is that, Ryan Reynolds, I think, he's, of course, 20 years later, roughly 20 years after making this movie, which, there's that talk, of course, that Wesley Snipes was not a fan of him on this. And of course, he wouldn't have been, right? He would have felt that everybody was against him. Everybody was sort of conspiring to take this character away from him. Ryan Reynolds would have been a part of that. And of course, Ryan Reynolds wouldn't have had a great opinion of Wesley Snipes making this movie. And then probably later, as he's making his own movies and he's starting to see kind of how the process is, like when he's making Deadpool, and it's like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. He was probably starting to see something similar. But I think also Wesley Snipes saw that Ryan Reynolds, his character, this Hannibal King character in Blade Trinity, is better as Deadpool. That Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool, it worked. The whole thing was together. So I think when Ryan Reynolds contacted him about being in Deadpool and Wolverine, he jumped at it. He really liked the idea. But I think also that Reynolds at that time had this sense of like, I can see now why he was so upset about how this movie was made. I get it now. It makes more sense to me. And let's give him a chance to maybe right the wrongs of Blade Trinity. And I think that's fantastic. I mean, I think he does get a chance to do that here. But then there's also this talk about, like, in the movie, about giving these characters their better ending, right? So, Elektra, obviously that Elektra movie was sauteed in wrong sauce. Not really any fault of Jennifer Garner's. I think, it would have been nice for her to get a do-over there. And then, like, Blade Trinity maybe doing a do-over there, getting another movie in. I do think it would be interesting at this stage. Now, we know that the Mahershala Ali version is kind of been put on the shelf, that they're maybe thinking about maybe like a Midnight Suns or something like that, and kind of maybe bring it back that way. What could you do with Wesley Snipes' Blade, though? Could you do something else that could be something really cool, that's like really within the tradition of the first two movies, something that really not only pays homage to it, but continues it in a way that gives Snipes a really good, and I don't think this would have to be the only one. You could make multiple with him, maybe. I was thinking about maybe pairing him with Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider. The only thing about that, though, it would just be awesome to do. And I was trying to think who they would even fight. I don't even know who the baddie would be. It could be some interesting. I remember Ghost Rider fighting guys like Jack-o'-lantern. Like, maybe that's the thing. But one of the interesting things about Blade that makes it different from Ghost Rider is that Blade is completely kind of based and grounded in science. Right? There isn't this idea that there's God and the devil, and that the devil, that there's like all these like sort of like mystical religious rules around vampires. None of that is there, right? It's about a blood disorder or blood disease or something like that gives vampires these powers, but also their weaknesses. So again, you can't hold up a cross. They don't die if they get hit with holy water, things like that. Whereas Ghost Rider is strictly about the devil giving him his powers and finding something in I don't know, and there's not really a God element as well, but there's definitely this devil element there. And so if you find out that, right, like, they come with this idea that maybe the devil, like Mephisto or somebody like that, created the vampires, maybe that's not exactly within what they were going for with the original Blade movies. So as much as it would just be really cool to see, Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider and Wesley Snipes' Blade teaming up in a movie, yeah, I mean, especially that Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance movie, it really kind of fits, I think, with the Blade aesthetic, and it would be a really nice team up to do there. There's also the Morbius thing and kind of bringing that back, but I don't know how that would work now. I mean, we wouldn't want Jared Leto doing that, right? We'd want it to be a Morbius that fits within the Blade continuity, within the Blade movies. So, that if we had something like that, it would be a really cool thing to have, but it couldn't be the Jared Leto Spider-Man one. And it's like, well, do they not have the rights? Would Marvel not have the rights to that if they've got the rights to Blade? So I don't know how that would work. The other thing that's interesting is that the Blade movies were made by New Line Cinema, and New Line Cinema was bought by Warner. So Warner actually owns the three Blade movies. And I don't know exactly how that works in terms of the rest of the property. So like some of the characters that would have been invented strictly for the Blade movies, I think Warner owns the rights to those. Like, for example, Luke Goss's character. So like, for example, Deacon Frost. I don't know how that would work with Deacon Frost. Yes, Marvel owns the rights to the Deacon Frost character because he existed in the comics before. But does Warner own the rights to the Stephen Dorff version of Deacon Frost? Which, would be kind of a fun thing to bring into the film in some way. But yeah, I don't know how any of that works. It's similar to the fact that Disney owns the rights to the Batman TV series from the 60s, right? Because that was a 20th Century Fox production. So they own the rights to it. And then when Disney bought 20th Century Fox, they now own the rights. So I don't know, maybe they could trade, right? Maybe you could trade, Blade for Batman. I don't know. So it's kind of an interesting thing there because, like, obviously they were able to use Blade. They were able to use Wesley Snipes' Blade in the movie here, in Deadpool and Wolverine. But I don't know how much of that they could actually use beyond the fact that it's Wesley Snipes playing Blade. I don't they don't mention anybody like Whistler or any of the other characters from the movie. So it is. I mean, they did actually show footage of the movie being shot in the end credits, but maybe they got the rights to that. I don't know. I mean, I do think, especially with this Mahershala Ali version of Blade being put on the shelf. And I know, Snipes gave his approval of, even though he said he wanted to play Blade again, and he is interested in playing Blade again. I don't know, too, if there's a sense from Marvel's standpoint of like, well, if we make this sort of one-off thing with Snipes the way we made this one-off thing with Deadpool and Wolverine, would it muddle the story that we want to tell with Mahershala Ali's Blade? Maybe. I don't know. But I think for fans, it would be nice to kind of have one more Blade movie that kind of brings him back. And maybe you don't have Ghost Rider. Maybe you don't have Nicolas Cage in it. Maybe you don't, maybe that's just me wanting to have fun, kind of the way I like to combine my Marvel characters together all the time. I don't know. I mean, I also think, too, that as much as the Deadpool Wolverine appearance really did pay homage to him as the guy who really started this whole Marvel thing, that he was the one that made it possible. He's the one that, even though, again, as I said, he's the bridge between the 90s comic book movie and the modern, the 2000s comic book movie. Kind of the same way that, again, I think that Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man is another bridge who, the difference between the two is that Kevin Feige, I think he saw what happened with Blade Trinity, because I think he'd worked on the Blade films. That's a big reason why he wanted to be able to do Blade, is that he had a kind of a special place in his heart for Blade. I think he kind of saw where maybe he was able to recognize that Robert Downey Jr. is his own bridge, the way that Snipes was the bridge in the late 90s into the 2000s. And he wanted to make sure he got Robert Downey Jr. onto the other side of that bridge. And it's a really interesting, I mean, that third movie, for that Iron Man, the third Iron Man movie, I think, the first two Iron Man movies aren't as good to me. I don't like them as much as the first two Blade movies. But definitely that third Iron Man movie is not anywhere near the kind of dud that the third Blade movie is. In a way, that third Iron Man movie is more of a get me over. It's more of a Star Trek 3, Search for Spock kind of Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. I mean, it ends up earning over $1 billion. It earns more than any of the other Iron Man movies. But it does exactly what you needed it to do to be able to get Robert Downey Jr. playing Iron Man and all the other Avengers movies and everything else after that. I do wonder if Kevin Feige saw kind of what happened here. I mean, there was other part threes that didn't do as well either. But yeah, he kind of rights some of those wrongs when he makes the Iron Man movie. But I think he also wanted to go back and make Blade and kind of fix what happened with this Blade Trinity movie as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting legacy. And I think, again, the fact that Deadpool Wolverine allowed Wesley Snipes to come in and kind of pay homage to that legacy in a way that was really, really fun, really organic, and for us as fans, as something I really enjoyed. I know I've talked about this before, that Ty, he saw the movie before me, and he was like, he didn't want to give anything away, which he didn't, which was great. But he knew how I was going to react the moment I'm in that theater, and first Jennifer Garner walks into the room, and then when Snipes walks in behind her as Blade, he knew how I was going to react. He knew how awesome that was going to be for me, and it was everything that I would want in a movie like that. And so yeah, I think now it's I do think that as we're sort of in this interesting period for comic book movies, it would be kind of a fun thing to have Blade kind of have Wesley Snipes as Blade kind of have a one-off thing. And I think from a production standpoint, I was looking at it just in terms of like the budgets and all of those kinds of things. I mean, the first Blade movie was made for like 45 million, which is like, I don't know, like 80 something now, 80 something million. I mean, 80 million for a Blade movie, and I think you could do that. And maybe make it direct to Hulu if you can't put it in the theater, though I would like a limited theatrical release at least. I think that would be kind of fun. But I mean, to give you a sense of Madam Web was made for 80 million. I mean, yes, good or bad as Madam Web was, 80 million, it's not like it was like, it looked like it was completely made on the cheap for 80 million. I think that worked out well. I mean, this movie Craven that's out now, 110 million they spent on that budget. I mean, I think we could do Blade for less than that. I think we could do Blade for 80 the way we did Madam Web for 80, and we could have something really fun and really inspired. Maybe up the budget a little bit if you want to get Ghost Rider in there. Maybe that's what it takes, and so maybe you don't need to go that much, but I think as fans, I think we could use it. I think it would, I think as Marvel's kind of keep moving in the right direction again, if that's what happens. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what this year looks like for Marvel, because the only thing they put out this year was Deadpool and Wolverine, but it crushed everything, right? I mean, you look at like Venom, Madam Web, Venom: Last Dance, and Kraven the Hunter. So 3 movies that Sony had come out this year, and all 3 of them together barely make half of what Deadpool and Wolverine pulled in this year. So it just, it was another, like, it was like big success, a big kind of, return to form for them. But I think, if you're going to have these years where you're putting out like 3 or 4 movies, why not sneak in a Blade or something? But see, I guess that's the other thing too, is they don't want to saturate the market, and they don't, the Blade movie. But yeah, I mean, would I rather, like, just looking at this upcoming year, I mean, would I rather a Blade movie or Thunderbolts, right? Would I rather a Blade movie, and I'm talking about a Blade movie with Wesley Snipes. This new Captain America movie, I would be interested in it, but I mean, would I rather watch that or Blade doing a 4th, Wesley Snipes doing a 4th Blade movie? I think for sure it's the second thing, right? It's that new Blade movie. So it'd be interesting to see. I know Marvel really kind of wants to get themselves through this period, get through 2026, and get through like the different Avengers movies and get them in the can, and start this whole thing over, bring in the X characters and all of that kind of thing. And I totally get that. I don't know. I mean, they have different branches that are doing things like, for example, Prey, right? The different Predator movies. They could, I think, Disney's big enough that they could farm out to like their 20th Century Fox arm or something like that, a Blade movie, and have it work. And again, have it released in the theater. If you don't, if you're worried about it watering down the market for your other movies, stick it at a time that you don't usually get movies. I mean, one of the things I think with Blade, I think it was Blade Trinity. One of the complaints that they made about Blade Trinity was that it was released during March Madness, I believe. And because of that, because it was really, they think that's what hurt its box office gross. So I don't know how true that is. I mean, the second movie came out. Oh, actually, no. Blade Trinity came out in December. So there was Blade. It was the second Blade movie that they said didn't do as well. They didn't think it did as well as it should have, because it came out in March of 2002. And so for people listening that aren't from the United States, March Madness is this period where college basketball in the United States, they do this huge tournament. It used to be, at that time, it was 64 teams would be in the tournament, and it was like a single elimination tournament that would go over 4 weekends. And so like Thursday and Friday would be the first nights, and then Saturday, Sunday would be the second nights, and then you do another, Thursday, Friday, then, and you kind of whittle it down till you get like the final 2 teams. But that opening weekend, everybody kind of fills out a bracket. They would fill out a bracket to kind of pick what the teams they thought would win. And then there's a lot of money being betted, a lot of money being, bet, wagered, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think they would talk about productivity dropping when the games would start on those days, on the Thursday and Friday in particular. And so it is possible that people weren't going to see Blade because the second Blade movie because of March Madness, but I doubt it. I don't. Maybe. I guess you're like I don't have the energy to go see Blade because I just lost a whole bunch of money because my Arizona team got upset by, I don't know, St. Mary's or something like that. It's like kind of how it worked. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's not as big of a thing now as it used to be. The March Madness and all of that stuff. But I guess that was maybe a thing at that time. I mean, looking at Blade Trinity, I mean, they put that one out at Christmas time, December 8th. So they were really banking on that thing doing well, and it just didn't happen. But yeah, I mean, why don't you make a new Blade movie with Wesley Snipes in it, put it, release it in March when you don't have anything else coming out, and make it for $80 million and let it, sit in the theater and make, $240 million, and then also throw it on your streamers as well. And I can't imagine a new Blade movie for $80 million wouldn't pull in at least 240, 250 worldwide, but probably more like 300 or 400 million worldwide. It feels like an easy sell. Yeah, I don't know. To me, it sounds like a no-brainer, but maybe I don't know enough about the biz to really be able to tell either way. But yeah, I guess we will call it good here. So again, unfortunately, we're ending kind of on a bit of a downer with Blade Trinity, but I was kind of hoping to maybe talk about a potential future movie that like my thoughts of a future movie might end this on a better note. But again, still those first two movies, they are again, I was looking at the list of comic book movies that have come out since Blade, the second Blade movie, and I don't know that there's anything that has come out since that second Blade movie that I like better than Blade 2. Again, I always talk about Captain America: Winter Soldier. I like it as much. Deadpool and Wolverine, I like it as much. Black Panther, maybe as much, maybe slightly less, but I really like Black Panther as well. So there are some comic book movies that have come out that I appreciate. I was thinking like the Batman ones. I'm not really a big fan of those like the Nolan Batman movies. I don't know why. So, again, my list is my own list. I think for people listening, you're probably like, oh, Dark Knight? You don't think Dark Knight's better than Blade 2? It's not about better or worse. It's what I enjoy. And I had a lot more fun watching Blade 2 than I did Dark Knight. That's just kind of how I felt about it. So so for me, I can't pick any comic book movies that have come out since Blade 2 that I like better than Blade 2. That's just my own kind of feeling on it. And so these movies are really special to me, and I think it was kind of fun to watch them again and realize how much they held up. It wasn't just 20-year-old Matt not knowing what I was watching. Like, no, I really enjoyed them then, and I really enjoy them now. So yeah, so I guess this is a good place for us to wrap up. As we're finishing here, just another reminder, my newest book, Nadia and Aiden, is available now. You can pick it up on Kindle Unlimited, or in paperback. Always appreciate the support on that. People have bought it so far. I haven't heard anybody who has read it yet. I mean, it's kind of one of those things. You buy a novel, you don't always read it right away, so I don't always know. But yeah, definitely want to pick that up and check it out. Of course, any of my novels are available. My author page is MatthewPoirierAuthor.com, and you can check out any of my novels there. But yeah, thank you everybody for listening. Hope everybody has a great holiday, and we'll be back on Tuesday with another main DTVC podcast episode. I'll talk soon.